So we have a brilliant cultural geographer here and a professor at CNU, Johnny Finn, who's going to fill us in on some facts we might not know and we might take for granted.
Thanks, everyone. I'll begin with just two quotations to start thinking critically about the persistence of racial segregation in American cities. The first is from the cultural geographer Don Mitchell. The landscape, Don writes, is the space that social justice makes. That is, our material urban landscape, the way we physically construct our cities and order ourselves within them, is a reflection of the kind of society we have created for ourselves. Take this photo that I shot just a couple of blocks from my house in Newport News. The mountaintops of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee rumble by on coal cars bound for the port of Norfolk. I can't help but think of the feminist and critical race scholar Bell Hooks, who wrote, "As Black Americans living in a small Kentucky town, the railroad tracks were a daily reminder of our marginality. Across those tracks were paved streets, stores that we could not enter, restaurants we could not eat in, and people who we could not look directly in the face. Across those tracks was a world in which we could work as maids, as janitors, as prostitutes, as long as it was in a service capacity. We could enter that world, but we could not live there. We had always to return to the margin, to cross the tracks, to shacks and abandoned houses on the edge of town." End quote. I think it'd be very easy for each of us to close our eyes and envision landscapes of social injustice all around us. The landscape is the space that social justice makes. The second quote is from the introductory notes to Blues for Mr. Charlie, where James Baldwin writes, "What is ghastly and really almost hopeless in our racial situation now is that the crimes we have committed are so great and so unspeakable that the acceptance of this knowledge would lead literally to madness. The human being then, in order to protect himself, closes his eyes and compulsively repeats his crimes and enters into a spiritual darkness which no one can describe." Thinking about both of these quotes together, it seems to me that the physical landscape, the very built structures of our urban existence, is one of the key factors that enables our collective deferral of social responsibility. It allows us to, as Baldwin wrote, compulsively repeat our crimes. Right there in the brute marginality of the urban landscape, McMansions and Section 8 housing, Whole Foods and payday lenders. This is the socio-spatial inequality that collectively we not only ignore, but also normalize, accept, and eventually naturalize as the ground truth of the supposedly meritocratic American dream, the space that social justice makes. How racially segregated is the 21st century American city? There are several statistical ways to answer this question, but perhaps the best thing to do is just look at a couple of maps. About a year ago, a researcher at the University of Virginia published this online map. 1 dot per person in the entire United States, over 320 million dots, color-coded for race according to the census's major categories for race and ethnicity. One blue dot per white person, 1 green dot per Black person, 1 red dot per Asian person, and 1 yellow dot per Hispanic person. This map becomes more striking the farther you zoom in. New York, for instance, you can look at from, this isn't working very well, from Long Island in the east through Brooklyn, the Bronx, Spanish Harlem, into East New York and Newark, New Jersey. Or Chicago, the famous South Side, the southwest and northwest wedges of Latino populations, and the white north side and suburbs. Or Detroit, 8 Mile Road famously dividing county from city, white from black. And even Hampton Roads. We'll return here in a moment. But how did it get this way? 2 formal governmental policies from the mid-20th century probably did more to segregate American cities than anything else. First, beginning in the New Deal and lasting until the 1950s, public housing projects abided by a neighborhood composition rule. Public housing was not permitted to alter the racial composition of neighborhoods where it was located. Projects located in white neighborhoods could only house white tenants. Those in black neighborhoods could only house black tenants. At the same time, from the 1930s to the 1950s, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, financed developers of large-scale suburban subdivisions all over the country. The FHA subsidized loans to developers on the condition that the houses in the subdivisions would not be sold to African Americans. The FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, even went so far as to provide model language attached to the deeds that developers used to be sure that no purchaser could eventually rent or resell to African American tenants or buyers. And these two flyers then, for Ferguson Hills and Peasway homes, both in suburban St. Louis, in addition to racially coded language, fine homes in a healthy suburban atmosphere, the phrase FHA approved literally meant whites only. Perhaps the most iconic of these subsidized segregated suburban developments were the Levittowns, 7 in all, designed and built by William Levitt in New York, Pennsylvania, and beyond. At the same time, at the height of the Great Depression, the government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation created a series of security maps, what are called redlining maps, in order to refinance mortgages and prevent widespread foreclosures. These maps rated neighborhoods according to several different factors, including housing stocks, sale and rental rates, physical attributes of the terrain, and, quote, the threat of infiltration of foreign-born, Negro, or low-grade population. Neighborhoods were classified into 4 categories. A and B areas were the most attractive for refinancing, while C areas were deemed to be transition zones and in decline, and D areas, colored red on the map, were characterized by detrimental influence in a pronounced degree. Race was the dominant factor in determining a neighborhood zone. White neighborhoods were classified as A and B areas, while black neighborhoods were almost always classified as D areas, areas in full decline. Of course, many other factors contribute to the production of segregated neighborhoods in nearly all metropolitan areas in the US, not least predatory lending practices, racial steering, or blockbusting, a practice that preyed on both white residents' racial fears and their desire to protect the value of their home. And while it certainly be simple to think that this is all in the past, the Fair Housing Act passed in 1968, nearly 50 years ago, that would be to ignore the work that this landscape what does once it's produced. I'll make 3 brief points then. First, this landscape of segregation perpetuates, long after its creation, significant economic disparity. In 1947, when the first Levittown was built, homes sold for $7,000 to $9,000, about double national income. Black and white families, including working class families and returning war veterans, could have afforded these homes, but only white families were allowed to purchase them. Today, homes in Levittown, New York, on Long Island, sell for $400,000 to $500,000, about 7 times national median income. Through buying real estate in these subdivisions, beginning in the 1940s, white families began building wealth and moving up the economic ladder, while black families were explicitly prohibited from doing so. After the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, when black families were finally allowed to purchase homes in these areas, they had long since been priced out. Today, while African American income is about 60% of white family income, African American family wealth is only 5% of white family wealth. This contemporary disparity between income and wealth is entirely attributable to segregated federal housing policy that officially ended over nearly 50 years ago. The landscape, as we can see, does work. Second, education, the so-called great equalizer. But in the context of urban America, we know very well that kids from poor black neighborhoods overwhelmingly go to underfunded schools with other kids from the same neighborhoods. As we see in cases like Kelly Williams Bowler, who actually did jail time in 2011 for sending her kids across district lines to a better middle school, the geographical lines of our segregated neighborhoods are policed in such a way that maintains and perpetuates both the geographical and social divisions among us. Third, when we look at segregated neighborhoods in the 21st century American city, we don't see all of these economic, legal, and social processes. Rather, the social and spatial structures are rendered invisible, and we simply see what we are told are individuals making individual choices about where to live, work, play, and go to school. The landscape makes a decidedly unnatural history and geography seem natural, seem that it's just the way it is. To visualize both the production and constant perpetuation of segregated spaces, we need only to overlay those 1930s and 40s redlining maps on contemporary economic and race data from the US Census. So I'll conclude very briefly by zooming in on a couple of neighborhoods just a few blocks from where we're sitting right now, on Ghent, Young Terrace, and Old Huntersville. Here just literally a few blocks to our northwest and a few blocks to our northeast. Let's zoom out a little bit to get a better picture of what we're dealing with and bring inside underneath it that redlining map of Greater Norfolk right here. And what we can see really clearly, it's immediately clear, there actually are very few A and B areas inside Norfolk itself, but plenty of C, yellow, and D, red areas. If we compare these this redlining map, this was from 1940. Compare this with three data points from 2012 census data, 2010 census data. Percentage black in each census tract in this area. Here are these same ones. You can see here the two parts of Ghent. Here is Young Terrace and Old Huntersville. And I've put the data here on a chart just right here. You can see percent African American in the respective neighborhoods. You can see the median household income, which is also stark. But perhaps what's most striking in thinking about how wealth is built, most American middle-class families build wealth through owning homes. The effect of the redlining maps and these segregated housing policies starting in the 30s going towards the 60s is most striking when you look at median home price. If I can get it there. Median home price, literally not even a mile apart. You can go from median home prices of nearly $400,000, which is more than 100% higher than the national median average, to places where median home price is less than $86,000, or about half of the national median home price. This urban landscape, and this is not unique to Norfolk, this is every metropolitan area in the United States, this urban landscape is the space of social injustice. Thank you.